online for authors. I'm chatting with Rebe Huntman, author of My Mother in Havana. Welcome, Rebe.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you so much for having me today.
I am super excited to have you. It was a very interesting book, different in a lot of ways than what I thought I was going to get. And we'll get into that. I really loved it though. But before we dive in, give a quick little elevator pitch as to what people are going to find when they read My Mother in Havana.
Okay. Well, it's a memoir about magic and miracle and love and loss. And more specifically, it's the story of a grieving daughter whose search to connect with her mother 30 years after her death brings her face to face with the gods and ghosts and saints of Cuba.
Yeah, it was fascinating. It was fascinating and sometimes a little confusing as I'm trying to figure out, like, who? Because there are a lot of things that I didn't know. There's a lot of information that we find out about Cuba and the religions that are found there that I did not know anything about. And so I found it extremely interesting. I'm curious, though, how you ended up in Cuba looking for answers about your mother when you're not Cuban, your mother's not Cuban. I expected someone to be Cuban.
Yes.
And I was pretty shocked when I recognized, wait a minute, that's not what I'm finding here. So how did you find yourself there looking for your mother?
Yeah, I love this question because it would have certainly been a different kind of book if either my mother or I were Cuban. It would have been much more linear or much more straightforward. And one of the things that I really enjoyed about writing this book and thinking about this book and about putting this book out into the world is that it's a book that defies the linear, and the expected. It is a book in the subtitle. It's a memoir of magic and miracle, right? My Mother in Havana, a memoir of magic and miracle. So it's not straightforward, but it does make absolute sense in a way. I invite your listeners to think about, in each of our lives, when something happens that we feel in our gut that surprises us, but also feels absolutely inevitable and right at home. And so for me, the trajectory that brought me to Cuba to connect with my mother began over 30 years before I started writing the book, when I lost my mother. I was 19 years old. I grew up in the Midwest of the US, where my mother had also grown up and lived and then died. And she died at age 59. I was 19. I was a college sophomore, and I was just bereft, right? When she died, I experienced such profound grief. I was just starting to make my own way as a woman in the world when she died. And so her absence felt crushing in ways that I couldn't even articulate at the time. But I received from very well-meaning college counselors and other adults around me some pretty pervasive and widespread advice, which was, you know what, your mother's gone. There's nothing we can do about that. Keep moving forward. Make something of your life. Make your mother proud. And I took that advice to heart, and I set out to make my mother proud and to make something of myself. And I followed those instructions for 30 years. Part of my forging my way in the world was pursuing a career in Latin dance and choreography, which took me to Cuba, where I worked with choreographers in the early 2000s. But I wasn't thinking about my mother during those 30 years. I was doing everything I could to not think about her. And of course, she'd always be there, right? Right. But there was I felt a real mandate to not cry in public, to not embarrass myself, to not be that woman who, still missed her mother.
Right.
That's exactly what I was. And then on the verge of turning 50, I found myself missing my mother so profoundly. It's like all those years of trying to pretend I didn't miss my mother just totally caught up with me. And I found myself aching for her in inexplicable ways. And part of the inexplicability of it was I had pushed her memory to the side for so many years, I could barely remember her. I had very few really sharp memories of her. And yet, so what was I missing, right? What was this thing called mother that I was missing? And in my country, and I had no real role models or indications for how to find that answer. I also did not, in my own country, find a way to reconnect with her that would feel healthy and socially approved of. But I did know about Cuba, and I knew about Cuba because of my career as a Latin dancer had brought me there. And in the context of studying dance there, I had run across the Afro-Cuban spiritual traditions that keep the dead close. The idea that you could make something of yourself without being connected with your departed ones is anathema there. Because in Cuba, there is this real sense that we are intertwined, we are connected with everyone who's come before us, and they're a chain of loving and supportive and protective ancestors that are ushering us through this life. And that the way we are successful in life is by staying in constant communication with those who have gone before us. So it's this very, very different concept of how we deal with losing a loved one. And it basically is that we haven't lost them. We've lost them in the physical sense, but they're still very, very profoundly with us spiritually. And the other thing about those spiritual traditions in Cuba is that they really celebrate the mother in a really big and beautiful way that I found absent in my own country. In my own country, I found role models like, influencers or pop stars or just there's so many role models, but none of them offered me the kind of template for the kind of woman I wanted to be. So those are the reasons that I set out for Cuba in an instant that felt both absolutely like my whole life had been leading up to it, right? All those years doing Latin dance, all those years traveling to Cuba. It felt like it absolutely made sense. And it also felt ridiculous, right? To be a 50-year-old setting off to Cuba on this pilgrimage to connect with her mother.
With your mom, who really had nothing to do with Cuba. And yet that's where you found her again, which I found it was a beautiful, beautiful story. You had to tell me the most important thing you learned on that trip. When you went and you said, I'm here to figure it out. What is the most important thing you learned?
Oh, what a beautiful question. And I would say, like with all good quests and pilgrimages, right? You leave yourself in order to go find something that you believe is outside yourself. And then you find that thing has been in you all along, right? So absolutely. I think, for readers, my mother in Havana, I think there's a lot of things that I explore and that I investigate and that I bring them along. I like to think that I'm bringing my readers along with me on my shoulders as we knock on these doors between life and death. And like, is it, is this veil between the living and the dead, the spirit world and the mundane world? Is it open? Is it permeable? Is it closed? Are we believers? Are we not believers? And, I bring my own questions and reservations, throughout the book. It's not like I went thinking, yes, I'm all in. I'm absolutely, I already know what I'm going to find. So, I wrote the book in that way so that together we're moving through experiences of seance and pilgrimage and initiations into, these worlds of the living and the dead.
Right.
And it's all very, what do I want to say? It's very grand and it's very spectacular and it was beautiful. And ultimately, when you say, what did I learn? I learned to trust myself and to trust the 19-year-old version of myself that missed her mother and that knew that the mother, we all have mothers. None of us have come into the world
without one, right?
It's impossible, at least right now. And we have different kinds of relationships with our mother. Some are very close, some are fraught, some are absent, some are, overbearing, right? They come in all flavors and textures, but it's a central relationship. Yeah. And so for me to be able to claim the centrality of that, right? That I am a grown woman who very much wants to stay connected with the most important person she ever loved and lost, which is her mother, and that it's not that hard to do. And that's something that, I think readers will come to the book through a number of lenses. They might be curious about Cuba and want to know more about Cuba. They might be interested in the spiritual traditions of Cuba. They might consider themselves feminists and want to kind of connect with that layers of the book, or the spiritual layers, or the travel experience, or just to follow a really, really good quest. But some might come to the book wondering how to connect with their own lost beloveds, right? And that to me is a door that's really, really interesting. And yeah.
Yeah. So I have, from all of that, I have so many more questions. It's like, let me see if I can keep them all straight. One of the things that really comes out in the book is that the religious and spiritual traditions in Cuba have kind of merged in different ways. Like there is the Catholic traditions with the Virgin Mary, but there's also the other traditions that have Oshun, who is the goddess of love, right? And that they're almost one in some ways, when really, when you think about it, the Virgin Mary and the goddess of love oughtn't to be, but yet in that culture, they've become one. You've found all of that. You kind of really leaned into that, which I found very fascinating. You've talked about the fact that you like the fact that there's this connection. You've now come home. Do you still try to keep that connection that you created there? Like, are you still trying to honor Oshun in some way, like you did there, or has that fallen away once you got home?
Yeah. Can I, with your permission, I'll answer that in a couple parts.
Yeah.
Just in case, if listeners are not familiar with Oshun and with the syncretization in Cuba, because I love that you brought that up. And it's one of the really beautiful aspects of that culture is that there are so many cultures that have been in contact together there and that have blended in some violent ways, some beautiful ways, all kinds of ways. But there are all these different cultures at work there. And one of the interesting things to me, and one of the puzzles of this book, as a woman who grew up here in the US, in the Midwest, and in a very linear, analytical kind of thinking mode, particularly, or especially when it comes to women, is I had grown up with messages that a woman could be this, or she could be,
yes,
right? You could,
right. You could be pure like the Virgin Mary, or you could be voluptuous and whatever, like the love goddess, but you couldn't be both.
But you couldn't be both. And that had tripped me up for my whole life, because I thought there was a rule book, right? And you could be this or that, and be careful what you chose too, right? Not only did you have to be this or that, but depending on who you were talking to, there was a correct answer about which choice you should make, which has felt very confining my whole life. And I think for my mother, even more so, because she, married my father in the late 1940s. She raised her children in the 1950s and then me later. But, she's kind of the quintessential 1950s American housewife. And there was a part of me that really wanted to rescue us both, but didn't know how, because I was so entrenched in that or thinking. I've got to be this or that, and people are going to judge me and all of this. And then in Cuba, I encounter this very different culture, which is an and culture. It's a culture of and. These religions have been syncretized over the years. And part of that was that when the Yoruba were brought from West Africa as enslaved people to Cuba, they brought their gods with them in their heads. But when they reached the shores of Cuba, they were told, no more of that. Meet your new gods, right? Right. And they, in order for their African gods to continue, they syncretized them. They were like, hey, that Our Lady of Charity over there, that Marian Madonna, she looks an awful lot like Oshun, right? So we're going to go to Mass and we're going to revere Our Lady of Charity, but in our hearts, we're also revering Oshun, the fertility goddess. So there's this blending and there's this and-ness that I found really interesting, because if we apply it then to our individual selves, right? What does it mean to have permission, to give ourselves permission as mothers, as women, as human beings, to be this and this and this and this and this? So I spent not only, in My Mother in Havana, I'm describing a very specific 30-day pilgrimage that I made in 2013 to Cuba to get the answers to some of these questions. What does womanhood, what does femininity, what does motherhood look like when we view it through this and lens? What secrets can I learn by studying these two figures, Our Lady of Charity, the Mother Mary, and Oshun, the fertility goddess? And try and understand it through this lens that it was so foreign to me and yet so promising, this and lens, right? What can I learn from that? I returned numerous times after the trip that I write about in the book. I continued to go. I continued to immerse myself in initiations into understanding and knowing the river goddess Oshun. I spent hour after hour in Our Lady of Charity's sanctuary, staring up at this very, very prim doll-like figure, being like, who are you? What can I learn from you? I read and I researched and I continued to interview people. So when you asked the question, I told you I was going to kind of take the long way there, but do I still practice? Am I still looking at these two spiritual mothers? Do they still have meaning for me? Yes, absolutely. And it continues to grow. And it continues to, I think that as writers and as humans, as thinkers, the best questions are the ones that don't have easy answers. And this one of what is the mother? What is woman? What is, right? These are big questions, and the spiritual questions. So they continue to evolve. And yes, my practice continues to evolve and be very central and important to me.
I love that. What does your family and close friends think? Because like you said, you're coming back with something very, very different. The culture is very different. The ideas are very different. The fact, the and culture is so different. I know you have a son. What does your son think? What do family, friends think? What do significant others think? What are they saying when they see you going on these quests and whatnot? I'm just curious, because I can imagine, I'm hearing in my head my own children and what they would be saying, and not all of it would be positive.
Yeah. Well, when we go out on a quest that's so different from what everybody else around us is doing, we risk, coming home and people being like, why did you do that? Right. Or not understanding. And I think I feared that more than I needed to. It's a thread throughout the book. Because again, I went to Cuba wanting to remake myself. I knew I wanted to come back different. I knew there were answers I needed to have and that I needed to live differently, because I was, like I said, I was nearing 50. I was feeling, I was grieving inexplicably still for my mother. I was feeling surprised at how I felt as an almost 50-year-old woman, because I thought my whole life, by the time you're 50, you must really know things. You must be really self-assured and just a total badass and have no doubts, right? All those doubts that permeate our lives when we're younger. And none of that was true. And I thought, if I'm not that badass version of myself that I thought I would be by now, when will I be that? And I wanted that. And so I went to Cuba to get that. I wanted to come home feeling totally in possession of myself, and not like that young daughter who either missed her mother or was still trying to follow somebody else's rule book of who she should be. I wanted to come back changed. And that's both exhilarating and terrifying, because, and I write in the book about my partner, Rick, who I had just started dating. We'd been dating about a year, and he's very analytical, very linear, not interested necessarily as much as I in knocking on doors of magic and miracle and testing the seam between the living and the dead. That's not really the way he's built. And so there's a tremendous fear that I would go and change so much that I would come home and
there wouldn't be anything there. Yeah.
I wouldn't fit into my old life. And that something really remarkable happened. The experiences that I had in Cuba that I write about in the book were so profound, so life altering. The things I learned, the things that I share with my reader, that when I came back, before the airplane even touched ground in Ohio, I had decided that I would risk losing everything rather than losing myself, rather than going back to the previous version of myself. And then I had to be willing to just say, look, this is the new me, right?
Right.
I talked to my dead mother unapologetically, right? And you can think whatever you want about that, but don't think it out loud in front of me, right? And I think that's been really healthy. So when you ask about what people think, I've been surprised at how interested people have been in the story and how much they've taken from. I've had so many people come up to me after they've read the book, or at book signings, and saying, oh my gosh, I lost my husband, I lost my mother, I lost my daughter. I haven't known how to function in the world since then, and this book gives me permission, right?
Yeah.
So that's what I hope. I hope that this book inspires people and gives them permission, A, to talk to their lost beloveds, B, to really reach for the biggest and boldest and largest version of themselves, and really try and inhabit and unapologetically fill in those contours of their best and largest selves without apology.
I love every aspect of this on a couple of planes. One, my husband and I rode across the United States on a tandem bicycle. 3,102 miles.
Wow.
And I thought that I needed to prove to people that I still had worth and value. And it turns out that I needed to prove it to me, to no one else. Mm-hmm. And I also learned that though I changed dramatically during the trip, I didn't change into something I couldn't have been all along. Mm-hmm. That it was all inside of me. And it was just digging around in all of the junk to find it. It was all already there. So you said that, and I found that to be very wow. And the other thing is I just lost my husband in January. So he had glioblastoma, and it was a 2.5-year struggle, and he passed away in January. And as I was reading this book, there were so many times that I thought, do I have the guts to do what she's doing, to reach out like that, to believe that he's right here, because I feel him right here with me all the time. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And when you say that out loud, people kind of look at you like, oh, she's probably losing her mind, Uh-huh. And it was wonderful for me to see you doing that and realize, okay, well, if nothing else, I have one ally out there who won't think that I've lost my ever-loving mind, because I feel as if he's speaking to me on a regular basis. Yep. And so everything about this book was just perfect. It was perfect timing for me to get the book when I got it.
I'm glad to hear that, and I'm sorry to hear about your loss, and I'm glad that you're talking to him, and that he's talking to you, and that you're receiving these messages. Yeah. I think that I'm not your only ally there. I think that we're living in a culture that does not promote the idea of talking to one's dead, but that's the beauty sometimes of leaving our own culture. And again, getting back to your initial question, why Cuba, right? I couldn't have gotten these answers in my home country, because the culture here is not one that says, yes, the healthiest thing you can do is talk with your lost beloved. Yeah. It's the opposite. And then
we're told to move on.
Or we're told to move on. And then you go to Cuba, where the whole culture is built around an opposite idea, which is the only way to move on is by connecting with those who will guide us and show us the way. And that the craziest thing would be to not talk to those people.
Right. And here it's crazy to talk, and there it would be crazy not to. And so I found it very refreshing to know that some of the thoughts that I had been having and some of the feelings that I had been having were maybe odd here, but they weren't odd. That there are other cultures. And then, and I started thinking about that. I know in the Japanese culture, for instance, that they have they have shrines to their ancestors. And, there are a lot of cultures that do that type of thing where ancestors really matter. And our culture, it doesn't matter as much. And it's just kind of nice to know that it's okay you're not really alone.
Yeah, and we wonder why we feel so alienated and so alone and so empty, and then we go shopping and we do these things to try and fill
this
hole, which is this sense of belonging and purpose, and this idea of connecting with the ancestors that is so prevalent in so many cultures does more than just buoy us and make us feel like we're not alone or like we're connected with people that aren't here physically anymore. It gives us a real sense of perspective. And this is something that really interested me as I wrote the book, is who are we as human beings linked in this ancestral chain, rather than, in the US, we're very individualistic and to think about ourselves, out there all by ourselves. But if we think about ourselves instead as being part of this linked chain of ancestors, that each generation has responsibility toward guiding the next, and even into the afterlife, it makes us reconsider, who we are in the moment. In Cuba, there's a real sense of needing to earn one's place as an ancestor. It's a real sense of pride and something to strive for, like being deserving of being an ancestor. It's not just, how can I get everything I can in this lifetime? It's like, how can I become the kind of wise, guide who will be able to guide future generations. And so it has incredible import, for our own personal lives, but also, for the world. What would it look like for us all to live with that mandate of how are we preparing ourselves to guide those who will follow?
Right. I love all of that. So I'm curious, Rebe, you're a dancer and a choreographer and now an author. Do you have another project that you're working on? Like, are you going to continue writing? Was this a bug that now you're going to do it, or have you moved on to something else?
No, I definitely define myself. I define myself because of all my and training, not so narrowly. I really define myself as a multi-passionate artist. I see a lot of connective tissue between the work I've done as a dancer and choreographer and my work as a writer. But I'm very excited about writing right now. And it's the main thing that I do. And it's awesome. It's the profession I put down when I'm asked, who am I and
who are you? Yeah.
It's writer. So I've just finished I've been working the last couple of years on a collection of poems, which are the collection is tentatively titled Zinnias in My Mother's Vase. And it's another look at what it is to be woman, what it is to be mother, but viewed through these concentric circles of my own experience. And then, other role models and women throughout history, and even mermaids and burlesque dancers from the 1950s. So there's a lot of voices that come into the collection. And so I'm just kind of putting the finishing touches on that. Awesome. And then we'll be looking for, a publisher soon. And then I've got ideas for other memoirs and novels. So yeah, the writing continues.
Fantastic. I'm glad to hear that. A lot of times when I talk with someone who has written a memoir type piece, they feel like, okay, I'm done. And it's like, oh, it's such a shame because they wrote so well and you wrote so well. And I was so engaged that I was really hoping that you were going to continue writing. So that's wonderful. So, hey guys, if you want to continue this conversation, head on over to Novels and Latte Book Club on Facebook. There you'll have a chance to win My Mother in Havana, a digital copy. So just find the post, tell us something you liked or learned on this podcast, and you will be in the drawing. So, Rebe, if someone wanted to reach out to you and talk to you about this book, future books, things that you learned while in Cuba, how can they do that?
Thank you for that question. The easiest way to find me is on my website, which is rebehuntman.com. And I'm also on social media, but I think my website is probably the easiest way. And
Right.
it also tells you where you can find my mother in Havana and all of that good stuff.
Fantastic. And I'll have all of that in the show notes, guys. So run right out, grab a copy of My Mother in Havana. It's fabulous. After you've read it, make sure you go ahead and review it, because as authors, we love to have those reviews. It really helps in terms of getting the word out there. Rebe, thank you for being here today. I thoroughly enjoyed the book, and I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me, Terry. It's been lovely.
Thank you for listening to Online for Authors, where I, Terry M. Brown, author of character-driven fiction and host of the podcast, introduce readers to characters they'd love to invite to lunch. Tune in next Tuesday for another podcast episode.